Hello and welcome to Indian Standard Time. I'm Siddharth Varadarajan and my guest today is Ambassador Tommy Koh, co-chair of the India-Singapore Strategic Dialogue and also Ambassador at Large for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Singapore. You have had a long association with India as a diplomat, as somebody who's been involved in the corporate sector. You've had cultural attachments. Ambassador Koh, we are now 50 years into formal bilateral relations between India and Singapore as two independent countries. But of course, the historical ties go back much further.
Indeed.
What kind of association would you say is important when you look at the history, that has a bearing on today's current relationship?
I would say that we are your best friend in Southeast Asia. If you look at the 10 countries in ASEAN, the country that's closest to you, most supportive of you, which has a major investment in your present and future is Singapore. This is partly because of history, partly because of culture, partly because of a coincidence of national interest.
Let's talk a bit about history. Most Indians also think of Singapore as a modern city-state, but as a geographical region, it's been around obviously since the start of time. But India and what is today Singapore have had an association going back 2 centuries.
Actually, the history of Singapore began not in 1819 as the British would like us to believe, but in the 14th century. From our archaeological excavations, from the historians, we have discovered that the island had been inhabited since the 14th century. And from our excavations, it would appear that Indians were trading in the region. Even then, and don't forget the Chola kings. The Chola had expeditions to the Straits of Malacca. So Southeast Asia was historically a sphere of influence of the Indian civilization. This is where you find, even today, monuments devoted to Buddhism, Hinduism, like the Angkor Wat. You have in Indonesia, Borobudur and Prambanan. Many languages in Southeast Asia are based on Pali or Sanskrit, and it's by no coincidence that a former capital of Thailand was called Ayutthaya, and the current king of Thailand styles himself Rama the Ninth.
That's right.
So there are deep historical connections between India and Southeast Asia, most of which has been forgotten.
And then you have the British who come along and through this artifice of an imperial structure create a relationship, a modern relationship between Singapore and India.
Yes. Well, the British was competing against the Dutch, and they wanted to command the maritime trade between China and East, India the Middle, and the Middle East. And the British had Penang, but they wanted to look for another port which guarded the southern entrance into the Straits of Malacca. So they chanced upon Singapore, they acquired it, and when Raffles landed in Singapore in 1819, he brought along with him Indian soldiers as well as Indian traders. So Indians have played a major role in the development of Singapore for almost 200 years.
And for the benefit of our viewers, what percentage of Singapore's population today would be of Indian origin?
About 9% of our population would be from the Indian subcontinent.
That's right. And mostly engaged in all kinds of all walks of life as the rest of Singapore's population.
But they are disproportionately prominent in leadership positions.
That's right.
Yeah.
But Foreign Minister Shanmugam is a familiar face here, as indeed the President.
A Malaysian friend once asked me, why are there so many Indians in high positions in Singapore?
Right.
At one time, the President, Mr. S.R. Nathan, was Indian. Tharman Shanmugaratnam, Deputy Prime Minister and Finance Minister, Indian. Professor Jayakumar, Foreign Minister, Indian. Shanmugam, Law Minister, Indian, and so on. So my answer is, they are there on merit.
Right.
And it shows that Singapore is not a racist country.
Right. Now we've had this long historical association, and diplomatic ties get established 50 years ago. But there's a long period after that, the Cold War period, when Cold War divisions in Asia affect what Singapore and India can do with each other.
Yes.
India had its own limitations. The economy was closed, or largely closed. After the end of the Cold War, however, with Look East, the policy announced by Narasimha Rao, we've seen a huge uptick in India-Singapore relations, driven, I would say, primarily by commerce and trade and investment, even if there is this rich tapestry of historical and cultural associations. How do you rate today, when India now has completed 1 year under Prime Minister Modi, a Prime Minister who, in a way, regards reviving Indian growth and increasing India's economic contacts with the rest of the world as his priority?
Yes.
How do you, what's your sense of where the India-Singapore relationship could now go?
Before talking about Prime Minister Modi, I think that we should acknowledge the historic turning point which happened under Prime Minister C.V. Narasimha Rao.
Yeah, P.V. Narasimha Rao, that's right.
Yeah. And his then Finance Minister, Manmohan Singh, and the then Commerce Minister, Chithambaram. These three leaders, C.V. Narasimha Rao, Manmohan Singh, Chithambaram, came to Singapore and said to us in a public lecture that we have decided to open up the Indian economy. We want you to participate in our future growth. We will tame the notorious bureaucracy.
That's right.
Yes, and there was a lot of skepticism, you know. But I still remember my young minister, George Cho, led a group of us to tour India in 1993. And on our return, we submitted a report to then Prime Minister.
3 years into the reforms process, actually.
Yes, we submitted a report to then Prime Minister Goh Chok Tong and told Mr. Goh that the opening is for real. And you should visit India and see for yourself. And we should encourage our private sector to invest in India. So that was the beginning of the story, you know.
That's right. No, in fact, that added a new dimension to the relationship.
Yes.
Today, we know that Singapore companies continue to remain bullish on India. DBS, which is the bank you've been associated with, is perhaps the first foreign bank to formally apply with the Reserve Bank of India to establish a subsidiary operation.
If you look at the big picture, we are your 5th largest trading partner in the world. You are our 11th largest trading partner in the world. We compete with Mauritius and alternate with them on being the #1 foreign investor in India. I'm not sure. I think last year we may have been #1 or #2. But Singapore is a major investor in India.
But I suppose since a lot of the Mauritius money is a conduit or sort of
some of it's Singapore money.
But a lot of it is round-tripping Indian money too. I suppose even when Singapore is #2, it's actually #1 probably.
So I think we're probably the largest foreign investor in India. But on the other hand, the Indian companies have invested very substantially in Singapore. You know, they made a mark in Singapore.
Now tell me, as somebody who has kept one foot career-wise in both worlds, you've been in the diplomatic side, you've watched India as a diplomat, you've been on the commercial, the corporate side with DBS. This perception in the run-up to India's election last year that growth had slowed down, decisions weren't being taken, is this a perception that Singapore and Singaporean investors also shared?
Yes, of course.
Okay.
Of course. I mean, we wish India well. I thought that in Prime Minister Manmohan Singh's first term, the economy was growing at a reasonable pace. And after the second election, I thought he had a huge mandate. But unfortunately, there were one scandal after another, and the government seemed to have lost its way. And so there was a period when the government was adrift. And as a result, growth rate plunged, investor confidence was reduced. So that was not a good period. We, of course, were hoping that in the general elections that that it will produce a new government that would have a good mandate from the people and a good majority in Lok Sabha.
Well, it seems your wishes were fulfilled because you have a government now with the majority, a prime minister who at least speaks the language of commerce, trade, investment, the need for growth, and has taken a number of initiatives. I think in India, people still feel that many of those initiatives have not necessarily translated into tangible changes on the ground as far as, say, the majority of people are concerned. But as a Singaporean, how do you assess the way the last year has gone? You watch India from fairly close up.
But Prime Minister Narendra Modi is not unknown to Singaporean.
Right. He visited as Chief Minister earlier.
We knew him when he was Chief Minister of Gujarat, and we followed his career when he was Chief Minister. I think he had a good track record in Gujarat. He promoted growth. He cleaned up the place. He tried to take care of the people. He was a clean leader. There was no taint of corruption about him. So it's a known quantity. So if he can replicate at a union level what he did in Gujarat, this will be good for India.
And so far,
I think one year is too short a time to judge him.
So far, what you've seen, I mean, if you look at international commentary, there's been some fairly harsh things said by the Wall Street Journal, which reacted very negatively to what they considered some confusion on the question of the tax liability for foreign institutional investors. So, your reading is still positive that the changes that have been implemented so far, and the direction is correct, is clear?
Positive. Here is a government, well, first of all, it has completely changed the morale of the country.
Okay.
You can't do anything if the people feel dispirited, if the Indian people don't have hope in their hearts, if they don't believe in their own future. And I think today, the Indian people feel optimistic about their future. There's a sense of optimism in this country. And I think Prime Minister Modi has generated that. I think that he's friendly, market friendly. He's trying to remove a lot of roadblocks, trying to make doing business easier in India, reducing taxes to internationally acceptable and competitive level. In our view, it's a beginning, but it's a good beginning.
Is there excitement in Singapore about this slogan or program of Make in India? Is that something which attracts Singaporean investors?
There are several slogans, right? I mean, you got act east instead of look east, Make in India. What we understand this slogan to mean, Make in India, is Prime Minister Modi's wish to build a robust manufacturing sector. Because if you look at India and its huge population, the 20 million young people that enter the work market every year, IT and services can't generate enough jobs, As my good friend Suresh Prabhu was saying, there are 2 million jobs for 20 million people. That's a deficit of 18 million. You need to create jobs in a manufacturing sector. And creating a manufacturing sector is not an easy thing to do. There are many things that must be in place before people will invest their money to start factories, to manufacture things in India, either for the domestic market or for the world. First of all, you need land for factories. Hence, you need a reasonable land acquisition law in your books. Secondly, you need infrastructure. If you don't have reliable power supply, nobody's going to build factories in your country. Third, you need skilled manpower. You can't have factories with no skilled workers. So, training young Indians with the necessary skills for jobs in the manufacturing sector is an imperative. And finally, your tax rates must be competitive, and you must be well connected to the world so that the products you produce in a factory can be either taken by a railroad or by ships to the world market. So there are many steps, you know. It's very easy to say make in India, but to translate this slogan into reality require that you address each of these chain, you know, in this value chain.
And in your interaction with the Indian leadership during your visit, you are convinced that
they totally understand that.
Let's move away from the economic side and consider the larger foreign policy dimensions of India and Singapore. Now, both of us are in Asia. We differ in terms of size and location, perhaps, but the challenges that both of us face in this region are in many ways similar. Asia is going through a state of flux. You have the rise of China, which is now an undisputable fact. Modi's foreign policy has 2 or 3 layers. He has made a very determined outreach to India's South Asian neighbors.
Mm-hmm. Which is the right thing to do.
This happened in the past, but I think he's invested new energy in it.
I think previous Indian governments have never given #1 priority to your own neighborhood.
Right.
You know, and based upon our own experience in Southeast Asia and ASEAN, I have for decades been telling my Indian brothers and sisters that your relations with your neighbor are not good.
Exactly.
India cannot be peaceful, stable, and prosperous
Yes.
if your neighborhood is poor and unstable.
Right.
So I give high marks to Prime Minister Modi that for his inauguration, he invited the leaders of all his neighboring countries to attend that inauguration. That is a gesture.
Right.
What I'd like to see as a follow-up is for you to be much more self-confident and generous, you know. Instead of asking reciprocity, why don't you open up your market to your smaller neighbors?
Well, to some extent, with Bangladesh, that's already happened.
Yes,
but
extend it.
Right.
Extend it. I think you've done that to Bhutan, to Bangladesh.
Yes.
I would say,
and we have a free trade agreement with Sri Lanka as well. So.
Yeah, I would say, you know,
Pakistan is the largest economy after India, with which commerce is virtually negligible.
Yeah, which is ridiculous.
I mean, official trade is hardly $3 or $4 billion.
I mean, can you imagine if Malaysia and Singapore were to behave in the same way as you and Pakistan? It's totally ridiculous.
Right.
Malaysia is our largest trading partner, the largest source of tourist arrivals in Singapore. We are the largest source of tourism for Malaysia. We are the largest investor in Malaysia. Why can't you learn from Southeast Asia?
Right. You know? Right. No, I think this is a...
Yeah. So I think Prime Minister Modi got it right. Pay #1 attention to your neighborhood. Secondly, from looking east to acting east is a slogan that means we want action, we want implementation. We don't want to just have a lot of talk, you know. In the past, too many Indian leaders talk, enunciate doctrine, make promises, but which are never implemented. So I think Prime Minister Modi is a doer. The man is impatient with words. He wants to get things done, you know. So let's hope that during his tenure, we will see much more action from India.
But specifically on the India-ASEAN front, say,
well,
I mean, can you give an example of slogans that were...
Yeah, there's something on the table. I mean, we already have an India-ASEAN free trade agreement in goods and in services, but the 10 ASEAN countries, plus India, plus China, Japan, Korea, Australia, New Zealand, 16 of us.
Yes.
We are trying to negotiate a mega trade agreement.
This is the regional comprehensive economic partnership.
Yes, absolutely.
Right.
India is a critical member of the 16. And my appeal to India is to be more proactive, to play a more proactive role in helping us to bring this negotiation to an early conclusion. And let's be ambitious, and let's try to bring this to a slightly higher level than the India-ASEAN FTA.
To be frank, I mean, so far, as far as the Indian government and different stakeholders are concerned, comprehensive economic partnerships have been rather more difficult to negotiate than the free trade agreements. And even some of the FTAs, like the ASEAN FTA, for example, you have lobbies here, palm oil, auto parts that have...
Bilaterally, we have a CHECA, which is a comprehensive...
Right. No, with India, Singapore, it's worked fine, but in terms of... at a larger level, I know that with the Koreans, with the Japanese, this is under discussion, but things haven't really progressed that far. But you're confident that with the Act East, this might happen.
Your senior leaders must take over the negotiation at some point.
Right.
Trade,
you mean escalated from the bureaucratic to the political level?
Let me put it this way. Most people don't realize that trade is strategy. Trade is not just trade. Trade is strategy. Trade agreements have strategic significance. The Indian government should realize that trade is too important to be left to trade negotiators.
Yeah,
yeah, I'm serious. And I say that as a former trade negotiator.
Right.
I was the chief negotiator for Singapore.
But I suppose the politicians kick in when things get stuck.
No, but my point is that at a senior level, there must be a strategic view of where are India's interests.
Right.
And even if you have to make small concessions here and there, the small concessions are more than compensated by your longer strategic benefits. So that's my point. Trade is strategy. Don't allow trade to be controlled only by trade negotiators. At some point, the strategic thinkers must take over.
Ambassador Koh, if I move now geographically north of Singapore, look at China, Prime Minister Modi has devoted a lot of effort to building the relationship with China. We've had 3 meetings between President Xi and Prime Minister Modi in the last year. They have had 2 summit-level talks. But there is still, one can't help but get the sense that there is uncertainty, there is suspicion, there is, I would put it different. I would say there's a deficit of trust between these 2 great nations. And I think above all, if I could just frame a question, I think above all in India there is uncertainty about what the Chinese want in the region. Are they, this era of peaceful rise, is it over?
The Chinese want exactly what you want.
Okay.
They want to be recognized as a major country. They want a seat at the top table. They want to have a prosperous economy. They want the capacity to defend their sovereignty and territorial integrity and never again to be bullied by big countries.
Right.
These are, in my view, legitimate aspirations of the Chinese people.
Absolutely.
I don't think they have any territorial ambition versus India.
Well, there is a territorial dispute.
Well, but this is a legacy of history.
Right.
I mean, we can blame our British friends. The British are very good at taking territory from here and there and joining them up.
But there's been a sharpening of the territorial dispute with a couple of ASEAN members on the South China Sea. There's the escalation.
That's a different issue. Let's stay with it. Sino-Indian relations.
Okay.
I happen to have studied the history of relations between China and India.
Okay.
It's a relationship that goes back 2,000 years. Read Amartya Sen's book, where he has a lovely chapter on the history of China and India. For most of that 2,000 years, China and India not only lived at peace with each other, but they benefited a great deal from each other's knowledge, expertise. Can you imagine there was a time past when an Indian was appointed by the Emperor of China as a head astronomer of China?
Right.
Great mathematicians of India used to teach in China. You taught them medicine, you taught them architecture.
Right.
So your advice? The period, the unhappy period, is really 1962.
Right. But your advice now as a Singaporean, when India and China find themselves rubbing up against each other in East Asia and South Asia, you have in a way competing infrastructure projects. There's the One Belt, One Road. India has BIMSTEC and pursuing. Now there's an element of complementarity, there's an element of competition. What would your advice be to the leaders of India and China?
It's not a zero-sum game, The 2 former prime ministers, Manmohan Singh and Wen Jiabao, got it right.
That the world is big enough for 2.
Yeah, exactly. The world is big enough for a rising China and a rising India. I think that's exactly right. And most of the time, your interests are complementary rather than competing. One is good at software, one's good at hardware.
And in fact, we saw the joint climate change declaration that Modi and Xi.
And you have often worked together, whether in climate change or WTO and so on, you know. There are no fundamental conflicts of interest between India and China, except for some territorial issues. Sure, the Chinese have a claim to Arunachal Pradesh, which they regard as part of Tibet. There's some dispute on the western sector in Aksa Chin. These are leftovers from history. You know, if you look at China's history of border negotiation, they have successfully resolved every border negotiation except two, India and Bhutan. So, as a friend of both India and China, I'm confident that when there's goodwill in Beijing and New Delhi, and there's a willingness to settle, the issue can be settled.
As a Singaporean diplomat, you know both India and China well. You wish both countries well.
Absolutely.
Ambassador Koh, on your very sage advice on that note, we have to wrap it up here. Thank you very much for joining us on Indian Standard Time.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, that brings us to the end of this episode. Do join us again next week for another guest. Thank you.